Why are so many high achieving women exhausted, overwhelmed, and questioning themselves, even when they're doing everything right? Listen, burnout isn't always about working too many hours. Often it's the invisible emotional load, unspoken trauma responses, and impossible expectations placed on women that quietly drain our energy and our confidence. So, in today's episode for WIL Talk, I've invited Adriana Leigh, who is a specialist in sensitivity. And she's going to help us unpack burnout because it's not a personal weakness. It's often those predictable outcomes of systems that reward overfunctioning and self sacrifice. So, if you've ever wondered why successful women struggle to slow down, set boundaries, or ask for help, guilty, this conversation will change the way you think about leadership forever. Adriana, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know you're calling in from Montreal, and so really grateful to have you on the show today and actually to dive into this topic. I hear it a lot from my clients.
Yes.
I'm definitely one of the guilty ones of asking for help, and people will, friends will say, Vicki, I'm here. And yet I'm always the person looking for them to come to me for help. So I think this is a real phenomenon that women experience, and
Yes.
we often get caught up in that. And just before we jump into questions, I was just reading something earlier this morning that was talking about 77% of us experience burnout in our current job. And so when you look at those numbers, that is huge. And so I'm really fascinated to jump into this and just talk about burnout. And, from your lens, you say burnout is often a trauma response
Yeah.
rather than simply working too much. So what are we missing, Adriana?
Okay. Right.
I know I just had a mouthful there.
I know exactly. Okay. So in a nutshell, I'm a recovering lawyer, which actually I think helps jump into, and
Great
I
point.
myself, right. So I myself, I partly came to this through lived experience, right? Years of what I'd say running on empty. I was a human rights lawyer, fighting the good fight, representing particularly victims of discrimination, harassment, all the thorny issues, many of them women. And trying to achieve that elusive perfection, right? For my clients, for myself, my body sent me signals that I couldn't ignore. It was my body that told me I had to stop, right? It took me many years to see, Vicki, that I was often advocating for the very things I also needed to heal from, and I couldn't see it. And it took burnout to start helping me connect those dots, right? So I was not only often absorbing the trauma that my clients experience without realizing it, and working so hard without realizing I also needed my own healing from some of the same things, right? And this would show up as something I think will be very common for many of your listeners: perfectionism. I'm a recovering perfectionist as well. Overwork, over responsibility, and not just an inability to name my needs, but I didn't even know I had needs. They were erased for so long. So what I started realizing after years of my own work and years of working with clients is that this isn't unusual. This is very common, particularly with women. It's a pattern that shows up again, especially if we're in caregiving roles, fighting the good fight roles, or we're a high achieving leader working for a team. And we're taking on this over responsibility. And often these are these are structural things built into how we are socialized to be as women leaders, right? And they're built into how we are. And so burnout is this kind of messy soup and combination of how we've been socialized, our own experiences like I had coming into the work. You carry that load with you, and then you're socialized to take on that load at work. And it just is this messy soup or stew, I like to say, that is this recipe for that 77% of burnout. And there are many statistics I cite in my book that those who have early experiences of trauma or traumatic experiences, for example, are at higher risk, many of which are women, at higher risk of burnout on top of the expectations that you have inside and outside the workplace. So it's this messy soup. And I think burnout alone doesn't necessarily cover it if we don't bring in that lens of what are our experiences we're carrying, contributing to that messy soup.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Where do I want to go? There's a couple of,
which road?
yeah. No, there's a couple of things that I want to really tap into here because, when you talked about how your body stopped, I also
Mm-hmm.
had a similar experience, which took me out of the corporate roles that I had been in. So
Right.
it sounds like we've had a similar experience. And,
Yeah.
you know, this conversation is probably more important today than ever because you have two women sitting here talking on this podcast
Yeah.
about how we didn't listen. We had the signals, but we
Yeah.
didn't pay attention.
Yeah.
So, from your lens, Adriana, how do you start to even recognize what's happening? Because you're right, we are conditioned and
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
socialized to you just keep going. You just keep going. You put the
Yeah.
smile on and you pretend like everything's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Well, the first thing I always think is you have to slow it down. You have to be able to pause for a moment to recognize what's happening,
Mhm.
right? To like take a little bit of distance. Um, and I think one thing that's been helpful for me over the years, especially when I was burned out, was that I did like a values audit for myself. I was like, who
Mm.
am I outside? This is why I call myself a recovering lawyer, because it was a core part of my identity,
Sure.
being that good for others woman, right?
Yeah.
Helping person. So kind of doing a stock taking of who I was and what lit me up, apart from being that lawyer,
Mhm.
apart from helping others, what lit me up as a person. And I really did this like values audit. And I think it's really important, and you can do that anytime, even when you're in a high performing role. You just have to take a beat to just on the weekend, 2 minutes to just like think of when I feel lit up, who am I?
Yeah.
And these are just little small reminders that over the year I've kind of I have a little script for myself, and I do a little stock taking every quarter for myself on like a values audit on where things are at for me. So that's one, I think just taking that distance, I think is really important. But we've been, as you said, Vicki, conditioned not to listen to our body and to push through. So I think one powerful reframe is just us together naming that, Vicki, together, and just being able to say, um, that not listening to your body, that's a script we've inherited. I would say I have inherited, and many of
Likewise.
us generationally, I think we've inherited this. I inherited this from my grandmother, from my mother, these scripts, and also these scripts from our workplace that tell us to, take on an invisible load, as women, to do certain things as women, take on an invisible care tax, often as women. And there are a lot of scripts that tell us to overfunction as
Mhm.
women. So for me, what's been really powerful is to be able to recognize those scripts,
Yeah.
as not who I am. It's not easy, but it's possible. It's what got me out of burnout. It was a
Yeah.
messy kind of, I dug myself out of the mud. But once I was able to see that, I started to be able to uncover, okay, so there's a script that tells me I shouldn't have needs, or that I should do more, and not doing enough. When I start to just kind of slow down and say, that's not who I am, and then I'm allowed to actually have needs, and I'm actually allowed to feel, then you could start taking stock of what your body, like listening to your body for actual information.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm talking to you years after also therapy. I will say out loud, years of doing this work. But it's now I try to think of my body giving me signals,
Yeah.
which is what I couldn't do at the time because I was in that loop of that script.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so with you. And
Yeah.
just for our audience, like know that it's not a one and done either.
No.
And that's very important because you're always having to look, adjust, reset, and you know, our bodies will tell us, but it can also show up in different ways. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so important that we're tuning in. Like you talked about your quarterly audit. That is so important. And having an accountability partner. Where are you? Right.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I was working on some things this morning because we're talking about the invisible load, and I'm actually doing my thesis right now on the invisible load, and particularly for women,
Mm.
and how trust and power plays into that. And as I was writing, I was in my mind, I was like, oh my gosh, like, where am I sitting right now? And when you talked about that autopilot, that's exactly, I'm in that zone. And I'm saying that transparently for our audience, because even on the surface, when we feel or think we've got it all moving in the right direction, we've done all this work, you can have those blips because
Of course.
life happens.
Of course. And I like that you mentioned the word autopilot, because that really speaks to that, core idea of called trauma sensitivity, which is a scary word, trauma, but at least 70% of us have some form of, if not more, says the WHO. I believe it's probably higher. It's kind of like the burnout statistic. It's probably even higher. The self-reported statistics are often lower. And so autopilot is often a signal that our nervous system has started taken over,
Yes.
right? And we're reacting rather than responding.
Yes.
So just our ability to name it, like you said, and say, oh, it happens and it'll keep happening. We all have a nervous system. And when we are in burnout, we are more in that reactive spot. So it's a time you really need to step back and be like, okay, my body is in the loop. And you got to kind of step back.
Yeah. And that's not easy, as we said.
No.
Like, it's hard because you have all these competing demands on you, and whether you're a caregiver for children, elder parents, you have a partner, like, there's so many things in life that make that difficult to take that pause, but you owe it to yourself. It's the oxygen mask scenario, right? If you're on a plane and that oxygen mask drops, you put it on yourself first.
Yes.
And that's so important. I want to talk about one of the biggest myths with burnout. We often say that, it happens because we're not resilient enough. And I know you have an opposite belief. So can you explain why burnout is more about what the environments are creating versus the individual themselves?
Right. This question comes up every time because it's a contentious one. And I think it's about time we start naming this. So there's a story I'll just briefly share from the book that I think captures this, right? So I talk about Marisol, name changed. She's got this supervisor, well-meaning, but also overwhelmed. And he starts noticing these shifts in Marisol over time, right? Quieter, slower to respond, less like herself. But of course, as many leaders do, never connecting it to anything structural, the workload, the pace of the work, the caseload, the lack of control over workload. He just blamed it, as we are socialized to do in Work and Beyond, as her individual issue alone, right? Locating it in Marisol, right? Or that myth we have of, oh, she can't handle the stressors of the job, right? Which we've heard before. So eventually, as many people do, and I did, she goes on leave and she comes back. There's no check-ins. There's no change in the workload, the structure, no transition plan. The whole caseload is waiting for her, as if like a little bit of time off, and she had to do the work alone would change everything. And I've seen this more times than I can count with my clients, with myself, as a rinse and repeat cycle that nothing changes, and it actually leads, and the statistic shows, to turnover, to more burnout, to conflict in the team. And it's this rinse and repeat cycle. People go on burnout. The individual, often women, are blamed. They do their work. It's on them to do it. They may or may not have, the capacity or the tools to help themselves. I'm glad there's coaches like you out there that can help them. But that being said, they come back to an environment that can exacerbate it for them, and nothing changes, right? So that's a pattern we keep missing. The root causes, I believe, are structural and also relational. It's a bit of a both and situation, right? So there's the pace, the culture, the power dynamics. You mentioned power, right? How conflict gets handled or passed off. Often I was a middle manager, and it gets often passed off to that new middle manager woman to handle the conflict on a team. How those structures, right? There you go. And I'm naming it now, but when I was in it, it was just an implicit expectation. So all of that is part of that messy, again, soup of the culture and the structures around it, and this invisible expectation that we absorb the emotional labor of our team as leaders. And it's not, part of our formal job description, but it's there. All of this is part of the structure that contributes to burnout. So it's often the environment. If we don't touch the environment, we miss a really important part of that puzzle. And there's going to be that rinse and repeat cycle that statistics naming are happening even on higher, even higher now statistics say than they happened before. Post-COVID changes, burnout is on the rise. And I just want to name individually, of course, if you also come in with your own past trauma or your own issues, and whether or not that be relational, things that you carried with you, especially if you're working in a high achieving role, you're primed to absorb the stress. You've already got that stress. Your resilience line is much lower, right? Your bandwidth is much lower, and burnout can happen. So it's this messy stew, but if the structures aren't there to help support you and give you some agency in shifting those structures, like control over your workload. One of the things is just having some agency over how the workload is distributed. If those things don't shift, the same thing will just keep happening. So I think we're just missing a very important part of the puzzle if we don't talk about the workplace structures that can help exacerbate burnout.
Absolutely. Adriana, I so agree with that. I mean, the system structure is built from years ago, and we have not updated them for the environments we're in today. We are accelerating so much faster, to your point. We recognize this through COVID, and we're working from home, and now we're mandating back to the office. And, there's all of these different dynamics that are taking place, but it's also, being able to look at people as human beings and their capacities. And I love the story you shared, by the way. And I think that's a very real dynamic. And what I would call out there also is, what tools was her leader given to help her be successful when she came back? Because that's a huge missing piece too. We put leaders in positions to lead, and they don't always have the capacity or the capability to lead. Maybe they were a great solo contributor, and we said, hey, we're going to promote Vicki because she was our, number one salesperson. But I wasn't really given those tools to help Marisol be successful on her return.
100%. I've heard this so often that often it happened when I was a lawyer, right? These brilliant lawyers were promoted to senior positions of management, but they don't have the necessary skills to be able to lead others. And I'll push it a little further and say, I argue that self-awareness, and what I call trauma sensitivity, but self-regulation, awareness, those are important, crucial leadership skills that I think every leader should be given, particularly in the new world of work, where we know human-centered leadership is becoming more important than ever with AI, with everything. These are core skills that I think that leader who is promoted needs to have to be able to handle that with Marisol, and to be able to handle her with judgment, without judgment, with curiosity and care.
Yeah. And that plays back into what you were saying with how structurally things are designed. And we reward based on, that person who's the driver, that person who, and let's say from a legal perspective, they have the biggest caseloads, they've had the biggest success rates, instead of looking at the dynamic from what is their ability to actually empathize, to have that self-regulation. And that just it perpetuates the system or the issues that are taking place. Yeah. So, a lot of our women that are listening in today, and we have men who listen as well. I've had some great, comments lately. Yes. I'm really happy. The word is spreading. Many women are listening. They're leading teams while also struggling with their own issues. So if we take Marisol as an example, she burned out. Her leader was also overwhelmed and potentially burned out. So how can leaders support others without completely sacrificing or losing, their own identity, their own well-being?
Yeah. Well, I think this is something I personally work on as well, particularly as someone who's, empathetic and, primed to absorb the emotions of others. And as women, we've often been socialized to do that as leaders. So I think to that point, one of the first things I think is for us to start thinking about defining what empathy really is, right? And how to define it is like you can witness somebody's experience without taking on the, I call it the hot potato. You
Yeah.
don't have to take the hot potato and burn your own hands, right? And I think you can't as a leader. So I think one question that I've been playing with lately is, whose is this? So that's
Yeah.
one guiding question. I mean, and it's simple but extraordinarily effective, and it kind of shifts. You know, when I'm feeling something, when you're kind of emotionally dysregulated, at least when I'm feeling, maybe I call it up here, or I'm feeling, you know, a strong reaction to something. Taking a moment to ask, whose is this? Taking that beat and that pause, and it can help your brain get back online to think about, okay, whose is this that I'm carrying? And I'm often done this in columns, you know, okay, well, some of this is, you know, this person who came to me, I'm worrying about what they're thinking, and I'm
Yeah.
taking it on myself. So even just the naming, it helps the cognition, the wheels shift for a minute and kind of slows down the dysregulation. So I think that's one important thing, but that's the inside work, right? That
Mhm.
question can carry a lot of power. A couple of the things that I do as a facilitator and that I write about in the book also speak to the work you can do as a leader with your team to create boundaries, which I think is
Yes.
really important structurally. We spoke about structures and little things you can do to change it. One of the things I say is important is to have what I call group guidelines, right? It could be for difficult meetings, a training, and you agree upon them, especially if you're going to deal with some thorny discussion. So having
Mm.
some guidelines or some boundaries about how we speak about things together. One of them I always say in my trainings is, we disagree with the idea, not the person. And
Yes.
that goes
Yes.
a long way. And I think what that helps the leader with is to give some ownership to the team on how the meeting goes and their own behavior. So it takes the load off of you as a leader and puts some accountability to the team itself on how they function together. It's not easy, but I've seen it shift things. And another
Yeah.
thing that is helpful is a simple reminder of what our job actually is. I was just thinking about that for ourselves and the team, right? Thinking about what is it that I am here to do. I had to do that as a leader many times, and often
Yeah.
I overstep my bounds to the personal and the personal care taking role. So I think just taking a beat to remind yourself of what your role is. It's not to carry the emotional labor of what's going on. It is to create a structure where if you've got someone on the team struggling, how can I help as a leader? What can I do to support you to do your job better? Just some examples. But it's not to take it on as, say, a mother or, you know, as a
Yes.
sister would. And I think that personal and professional line is something that we have to keep reminding ourselves of. So you can be
Absolutely.
caring and boundaried. And in fact, I
Yeah.
think you can be more caring when you're boundaried.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. And,
Yeah.
I just want to tap into something you were saying there, because often when that happens, when, you're working in team environments and you have somebody who maybe is more outspoken, who's trying to drive a point home, sometimes as leaders, you have to step back and say, okay, why is it that that person feels the need to be so strong? Is
Mhm.
it being driven by their ego? Is it that need to feel that they're absolutely right? And if they're not right, what does that mean about their role in the team? And I see that one a lot with especially individuals who come out very, very strong in making their point. And so it's helping them regulate, right? So that they're not being kicked out of the group. They're not, but it's understanding, who is that person talking? Is it
Mhm.
you or is it your ego that's really driving that conversation? Because it alienates other people sitting in the room, and they may not feel as inclined to share if someone is overtaking.
Mhm. This is why I think guidelines are often overlooked,
Yeah.
and we can do them. You can do them in a not a heavy lift way, especially if people aren't used to it in some corporate environments. But I do it in corporate environments. It's just a question of how you know, you don't have to call it rules exactly. So, but I think that's really important to your point of those who may be dominating a conversation, and they themselves may or may not be in their own reactivity for
Yeah.
some reason. Why does that person, you know, feel this need to speak up? So having those guidelines, often I say, in meetings, if you're a shy person, let's have a braver space where those who are a little bit shyer get the chance to take some space. And those, like myself included, I'm a chatty person, I, you know, can be gregarious. Be mindful of how much you're taking up space. And I think when you name those things, particularly as a leader, if you say got it on the wall or you've written it down somewhere, you can come back to it, you know, and circle back to it. Okay, I've heard from you. I'd like to hear from X, Y, and Z person, right? Just to, and sometimes, like you said, it gives that person a chance to regulate themselves and be like, oh,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's really important because they have a lot of value to add. It's how they're,
Mhm.
sometimes it's how it's coming across.
Yes.
So let's kind of shift a little bit into your 4R model. So you talk about regulation, recognizing, responding, and reflecting. And that is incredibly practical. But can you walk us through how women can actually use that during, you know, those crisis moments that, you know, overwhelm when the noise around you is, you're like, you can't even think because there's so much going on.
Totally. Well, those little crisis moments, I would argue, happen every day. They can happen,
Hmm.
like you can have an inner crisis where you
Hmm.
have a brain fog or brain freeze. Um, so that's when the 4 R's are the most important, and they don't have to be some grand gesture. Often, emotional regulation, which is the first R, is something so underemphasized in leadership. I don't know if you'd agree, Vicki, but I would argue that when I brought this model in, people were like, "Oh, I can take a beat to calm down." Like it's just go go go, right? That's often the mentality in workplaces. So it doesn't mean that, let's say you're in a, I'll give an example, right? So let's say you're in a really difficult conversation. I've had these kinds of conversations. You've got a team member coming to you and they say, I've got an issue with the workload, right? You might, depending on your own background too, go into a shame spiral. Not you, but you know, let's say it's me, I could go into a shame spiral thinking, you know, there's a part of me that says, oh, she doesn't like me. I'm a terrible leader. You know, my shoulders go up here. I want to defend myself. I can't think clearly. I don't know how to respond. These are all cues that you're dysregulated. So one of the real quick things that you can do, if you have time, you don't necessarily have to respond in the moment. You know, you can take a beat. You know, if you have to respond and stay in that conversation, you can take a beat, often remembering to breathe. That's one
Hmm.
often thing that people forget to do, is
Of
to
course.
just breathe or to slow down. Like an inner mantra, I have to do that often. My thoughts go quicker.
Yes.
Right.
Likewise. Likewise.
Right. But they're still going a mile a minute. Right. So if you're like that, so just slow it down. Right. Like take a breath. Honestly, if you just take one breath to the count of 4 in, one breath to the count of 4 out before jumping into response, it can actually make a difference to get your brain to downregulate.
Yeah.
So that's one simple thing that you can do in the moment. Simple, not necessarily easy, but it can make a difference for you to then be able to, second R, recognize the context in front of you. Because if you're so up here and defensive, you're not actually going to be able to see the person in front of you or
Right.
hear them properly.
Yeah.
So then when you're able to slow down, you can get curious about what's true about what they're saying, not just what your nervous system is telling you. Oh, she thinks I'm a bad leader. She thinks I'm terrible. And then you're in the defensiveness, right? Maybe this is somebody you see, oh, they've generally been like a capable person on my team, solid employee. They've never badmouthed me before, right? Recognizing is separating the story that your nervous system is telling
Hmm.
you from what's actually in front of you. So seeing the person in front of you, right? So that's like the recognize, and then you can respond. So that's why I intentionally have regulate, recognize, then respond, because we always jump, and our nervous systems tell us to do this, to jump to a response, and it's often not a response; it's a reaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're able to then see what's in front of you, get some context from curiosity, you can be more respond with curiosity, something like, tell me more about what's heavy. You can ask questions instead of jumping to fix it mode or to justify or defend yourself. You know, what would help you with the workload? Getting more information from this person. Reminding yourself too in the respond that you don't necessarily have to fix everything in one conversation, but at responding with curiosity is something that you could try to do. And then reflect, often forgotten, is taking a beat after that meeting to see how it went. You can, how did it go? What worked well? When did I get a little defensive? And, you know, taking a beat for yourself, and then remembering also to reflect and circle back with that employee too. Reflect with them and circle back and say, you know, we can have a second part of this conversation, reflect on how it went, get a little bit more information, and then figure out what to do. So I like to say that these 4 R's are iterative, and you can try them anytime and see how it went. And oh, it didn't go so well. Oh, that worked for me. Oh, that didn't work so well for me. And then figure it out. It's an iterative process you can carry with you through each conversation.
Love that. And just to add to that, that is very true as a parent as well. Or if you are a caregiver, right? Like taking that, like I do a lot of work on consciousness, so reaction versus response. So we work in very similar ways, but it's getting people to recognize what's the real underlying story that's actually happening. Yeah. And I say that in particular as a parent, when that teenager or even that child comes to you and they're having a tantrum, and you, even with that, you get defensive. That I loved how you shrugged your shoulders that you do, and you hold your breath because you're like, oh gosh, why are they coming at me now this time? You know, I must be a horrible mother. And that's not the case at all. It's very much that child, that person needs a place to unpack what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. Exactly. And it's true with our employees and our teams as well. And so I love how you talk about distinguishing the person and the situation. That is so important. So what is the real message?
Exactly. And I think we can apply that to ourselves too. Like that, you know, it's not, the burnout isn't me. My shrugged shoulders isn't me. My defensiveness isn't me. It's the situation I'm responding to. Exactly. And the shrug, you notice the body language I was acting out. I think that in of itself is a way to help you regulate in the moment too, is when you notice, you even saw Vicki, I was acting out, shoulders up, right? Even noticing that your shoulders are up and noticing that can help you regulate.
Yeah. And I really love the fact that you brought up the breath, because I mean, if you practice yoga, you do concentrate on your breath.
Right.
I see this so often in clients, and you know, I do a lot of my work virtually, and you physically see people holding their breath, and that is where that tension starts to boil. And being able to release that. And I actually had a client one time said to me, she goes, okay, I'm breathing, Vicki, I'm breathing. She said, I, you know, on my computer to remind myself to breathe. And it is simple, to your point, but not easy to do, because when you're in the heat of it, you're firing on fight or flight. And that you've got to get regulated. That amygdala has to calm down enough for you to be able to respond from that, you know, place of intelligence, that place of genuineness, that, you know, to support whatever the situation is.
Exactly. And I think to your point, you mentioned the amygdala. One thing I talk a lot about in the book and generally is this idea of false urgency that our nervous systems often get us into. This idea that, and our workplaces do it as well, we get into this loop of chronic, we think something is urgent, or we act as if something is urgent that actually isn't. So really thinking about what kind of situation is this to help us realize that some things may not be urgent. Somebody may not be happy, but there's not necessarily a life or death emergency. It can kind of help you calm down and your amygdala calm down from a survival response. And I think that's an important thing to name.
Awesome. Love that. So if a woman is listening and she's recognizing herself, because she's probably going, oh yes, I do that. Oh, I've certainly been there. She's exhausted. She's over functioning, and maybe quietly wondering how much longer she can actually keep things going. What's the first step she should take? this week, to even help her start to regulate better?
One thing that helped me was, I think, to remember our conversation about the scripts and start to separate yourself from those scripts. So start to see what those inner voices are. And I think that's really was an important part of my own healing for my burnout, is to start to see, what was I saying? What are those voices? Or I'd say a part of me was saying not enoughness, and separate yourself. That's not me, right? Separate yourself out, right? Another thing that, if that sounds a little complicated, is what we said before, which is the breath. Honestly, I tell one of my good friends who has 2 children and she has 0 time in her hands, and I empathize with many of your listeners, is literally just taking a moment or two to remember to breathe, focusing on your breath, or a minute. And that's something that may be doable, because just being able to get conscious of your breath, it gives you a chance to be in tune with your body for 2.5 seconds. But that's a practice. And it comes back to what we talked about at the top of the hour, which is that we're often attuned to not be attuned to our body as women. So even that really micro practice, I think, of listening and tuning into your breath, I try to do like 1 minute of silence every morning, which is very hard for a person like me. I'm not
Yes, me too.
As you see, I'm a chatty person. So I try to do 1 minute of silence in the morning, and just sitting. And it's incredibly difficult. And it's become a practice, though, that I've honed. And I think it helps us become a little bit more attuned, and normalizes being attuned to our surroundings and our body. So it's a micro practice that I think most women could fully do.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. So 2 things. I know we have to wrap up here. What do you think is going to define the workplace of the future?
Huge question. I think, well, beyond AI, which we know is the obvious question, I think, because I'm a strong advocate of empathy and trauma sensitivity at work, I think these human skills, and indeed, I would call it trauma sensitivity, is going to become much more important, or what people have generally labeled as soft skills in leadership, under that umbrella, which we can have a conversation about why we can rename them, Vicki.
I call them power skills.
Power skills, right? I think that those are going to be the skills of the future in leadership. I think that's where the conversation is going. Of course, we see some resistance to that in leadership conversations. We always do. But we wouldn't see that resistance if it wasn't an important conversation to have. So I think that that is the future of work. And there's going to be that question around, how do we integrate those competencies that become core leadership competencies, not just these nice to haves. So I think that's where it's headed.
Awesome. Love that. I totally agree with you. I think the humanizing of leadership becomes more important than ever. And I think people are also starved for that connection, for that, not the surface. They want the deeper connections, and, really helping each other to navigate all the things that are going on. Yeah. So, second thing, Adriana, where can people find your book? And how can they find you? I mean, this has been a great conversation. The 4 R's are super important to practice. Even if we practice one, just try one today.
I'd say start with the first R. Give it a couple. Start with the first R.
Exactly. So where do they find you, and where do they find your book? And do you have a book there, so visually those watching on YouTube or on our website, they can actually see. So you see trauma sensitivity at work.
How to
and where do
lead
they
safe,
find
inclusive teams? Yes. So there are many places. So here's the book. I will be getting a stand, but for now, I like to be tactile and hold the book for folks, right, in my hand, right. So trauma sensitivity at work: How to Lead Safe, Inclusive Teams. Available anywhere you buy your books online. If you want to reach me particularly, you can reach out to my website. I think, Vicki, you've got that link that you can maybe have in the show notes.
We'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Perfect for folks, and they can reach out to me. There's a book page, and you can easily link into the book and different places you can buy and purchase the book from that page. So that could be easy. Amazon, Indigo, if you're Canadian. There are many places to buy it, and there's bulk purchase options depending on whether you want it for a team. I've had a lot of folks reach out for book clubs, because this is often a conversation you want to have with others, right?
Nice.
And kind of work through these issues. So there's options for that on the book page. They can also follow me on LinkedIn, where I share some leadership ideas over time. And I think that will also be in the show notes, Vicki.
Absolutely.
So those are probably the two best places to reach out.
Okay. Terrific. Adriana, thank you. I mean, clearly you and I have a lot in common and I'm so grateful we got to have the conversation today. Any final parting words you would like to share with our audience before we wrap up today?
Well, I know I'm speaking to a lot of, emerging and senior women leaders. So I just always remind you to remember who you are at your core. Right? Remember that you are not the scripts you've inherited. Remember your values are and what lights you up every day, especially when you feel that you're burning out. Remember who you are.
Oh, that's beautiful parting words. Absolutely. You're not your job. You are who you are, who you're being. Love it. And audience, thank you. We're so grateful you continue to listen in to the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. We work really hard to bring great guests like Adriana to, let you walk away with something that's going to actually make an impact in your life. And so if there's topics that you would like to hear about, please do reach out to us. Or if you have questions for Adriana or myself, you can reach out to both of us, and happy to respond to that. Also, just remember that on the Women in Leadership Empowered website, you can find our free leadership quiz, which gives you a lot of insight as to how you're showing up as a leader. And that's been a hot topic today. So chime in there, take that quiz. Let's see how you're doing as a leader. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and have an amazing day, amazing week. And we'll see you on the next Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Thanks again, Adriana.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for WIL Talk, sponsored by Women in Leadership Empowered. To learn more about our programs, please visit www.wilempowered.com. We look forward to seeing you in our community.